What if I told you, you can't lock up the will to win?
We are all about to witness an event that's never happened before in television sports. A top boxing contender coming inside the walls of a prison to fight an inmate.
We called him the Great Scott. He was built like Hercules.
James Scott is one step closer to the light heavyweight champion of the world.
I don't know that everybody thought this out all the way through.
The all-new 30 for 30 podcast. Subscribe now on the ESPN app or Apple Podcasts.
30 for 30 podcast is presented by Mini. We're finding the best sports stories for you right now. And to do that, we're behind the wheel of the new Mini Countryman, the biggest Mini yet.
Please proceed to the highlighted route.
To find great sports stories, you have to get out into the world and follow your instincts. That's where the new Mini Countryman's all-wheel drive comes in handy. With all four, we can chase down a story in the city, the country, and most places in between. No matter what story you're chasing, the new Mini Countryman will help you find it. It's available now, and so are 30 for 30 podcasts.
It was BYOG, bring your own guts.
This is the best.
Do you hear me?
Of the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Very sad news to pass along. The legendary Frank Broyles has passed away at the age of 92. He had been fighting for his life for a number of weeks, and the school announced just moments ago that the great athletic director, head football coach, and ambassador of the game has passed away. While many correctly point out the greatness of Frank Broyles as a football coach and as a star player at Georgia Tech, his most important contribution to the University of Arkansas came as an administrator. By playing the chief role in leading Arkansas into the Southeastern Conference by the 1992 football season, Broyles ensured the school's financial security for generations to come, as well as elevating its national profile. Broyles, always a visionary, knew it was a calculated risk leaving the Southwest Conference. And initially, it had a negative impact on recruiting in Texas. But he knew the school needed a clean break with a league that had been battered from a public relations standpoint. Interestingly, Broyles later admitted he wasn't certain Arkansas would be included in the new Big 12, which saw 4 Southwest Conference schools join the Big 8. By now, we have heard the myriad of accomplishments for Broyles at Arkansas. But it's worth noting he had so many other interests, especially television.
The Bulls have shown that Southeastern Conference is the toughest league in America, and they are the champions of that league.
Many college football fans were weaned on Broyles as an ABC commentator with Keith Jackson, perhaps one of the most iconic pairings in college football history. His down-home Southern style of analyzing a football play still resonates today.
Number 25 is the fullback. He has to take pride in his work, and he made an outstanding block that allowed Walker to go in for the touchdown.
In the end, what is so remarkable are the multifaceted layers of his career. Player, coach, administrator, ambassador. If he had only done one of the 4, he would forever be remembered as a Hall of Famer. But the remarkable distinction of Broyles' life and career is that he did it all. He did it with class and grace. At times like this, it is easy to fill in the blank when a great person passes and offer a line about how greatly he or she will be missed. But in the case of John Franklin Broyles, it is not only true that he will be missed, but that his legacy and mark on the field of intercollegiate athletics will live on forever. 104 coaching wins at Arkansas, 144, followed by Houston Nutt and Lou Holtz. Coached Arkansas to a national title in arguably one of the most famous college football games ever in December of 1969, a 1-versus-2 matchup against the University of Texas. And we welcome in someone who has covered the scene in Arkansas for a number of years, the former captain of the Razorbacks, someone who knew Coach Broyles extremely well. David Basil joining us. David, thank you so much. I know while this may have been expected by many, it's still an incredibly sad day across college football, but especially in your state of Arkansas. Good afternoon.
Hey, Paul, thanks so much. I think you said everything correctly, and your presentation a second ago was spot on. Here in Arkansas, he's an icon. I'm not so sure if you did. We've talked about this many times, Mount Rushmore for people who've impacted this state. He's on there with the former president and a founder of the biggest company in the world, Walmart, and maybe for the psyche and confidence of this state, he was probably bigger than either one of those. If there was a 5-tool player for football, he was it. You mentioned it in your piece, Paul. He did it all. A kid who, was a SEC MVP at Georgia Tech and goes on to win a national championship as a coach. And then an amazing AD who took some chances and was criticized but stuck by his guns and hired coaches like Lou Holtz and Nolan Richardson. And as you said, one of the greatest, I think, combos in calling football games with he and Keith Jackson there ever has been. And then at the end of his life, he had one more thing to do, and he lost his wife Barbara to Alzheimer's, and so he realized that people needed help in caring and caregiving for Alzheimer's patients. So he committed his last part of his life to that. So he was a unique guy that when he walked in a room, Paul, as you know, he was as charismatic a guy as I've ever been around. And, I've done the Broyles War for 22 years, and on that committee we've had every coach you can think of, Lou Holtz and Bobby Bowden, Vince Dooley, Bo Schembechler. But when Coach Broyles would get on that phone or walk in a room, I'm not sure there was anybody more charismatic with that Southern drawl as Coach Broyles.
And, David, I want to ask you about that award because obviously it memorializes him. It's given to the top assistant coach. What was the genesis of that? And obviously you played a key role, but what about Coach Broyles?
Well, Paul, it was one of those things that I was a player under when Coach Broyles was the AD. I played for Lou Holtz and Ken Hatfield, and once I graduated, I was looking for some things to do, and I started looking at Coach Broyles' history and looking at the amazing track record he had of molding, selecting, and having assistant coaches go on to be successful head coaches. And so I went to him and said, Coach, I don't know how you did it, but I'm not sure there's anybody else in the history of college football that have produced coaches that have gone on to be successful like you have. You mentioned, Joe Gibbs and Jimmy Johnson, Barry Switzer, Hayden Fry, Johnny Majors, just to name a few. He had about 27, I think, that went on to become head coaches, and they won 6 Super Bowls and 5 national championships, over 2,000 wins. And I asked him if he would mind us doing that award in his name, and he knew the importance of assistant coaches, Paul, and he said yes, and I think he was very proud of it. And it's grown into an award now that certainly you look at some of the coaches around the country, it's a way to recognize what the assistant coach means, whether you're a guy like John Chavis at A&M or up-and-coming guy like Lincoln Riley and Tom Herman, who've been the last winners, or Brent Venables at Clemson. So it's really cool that we're able to now remember that, legacy of Coach Broyles and his uncanny ability to pick assistants and mold them. And you listen to Jerry Jones at his Hall of Fame speech, and Barry Switzer. All those guys were so influenced by the personality of Coach Broyles.
In thinking about his life, David, as you have many, many times, I was just struck by the many influences, and I don't think I mentioned it in that piece, but he was also an executive at Augusta National. He played a role on the television presentations so many years, and from that to television with Keith to the AD to that. You forget his football coaching career, but I know there's no one in Arkansas who has forgotten that aspect of it, especially that national championship.
Well, in the 60s, Paul, there were, it was Alabama, Arkansas, and Texas were the dominant teams of that era. And, again, you got Frank Broyles saw something in Arkansas, Paul. He saw potential. He spent 1 year at Missouri, comes to Arkansas, and made Arkansas proud after, like you talked about, what had happened in 1957 at Central High School. He gave Arkansas something to be proud about and put us on the national map. And like you said, in talking about him, I forgot about, the green jacket presentations. He was everywhere, and I'm not sure, Vince Dooley, has been an AD once, he finished up. Darryl Royal did that at Texas, but I'm not sure anybody was as talented to do all those things that we've talked about today, that like Coach Broyles was. And it's an amazing, Paul, when he would be in a room, he was so energetic and charismatic, and willing to be able to step out there and be criticized. That was another thing I was always impressed with the coach, whether it be about games at Little Rock versus Fayetteville or the move to the SEC. He did what he thought was best, and never tried to, if somebody was mad at him or felt he was an enemy, he would try to go to them and respect their opinion, and I always valued that in Coach Broyles as well.
David Basil, a captain of an Arkansas team that he was there as Coach Broyles was the athletic director. David, we wish you well. I know this is going to be a very difficult time in your state, but everyone's thinking of you and your many Arkansas Razorbacks, and we hope to talk to you very soon.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David Basil, joining us, a former captain who came up with the Broyles Award honoring Coach Broyles, and will continue to so many years to come. Coach Frank Broyles passing away earlier today at the age of 92.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Pat Dilley covered the team for so many years, and Pat, it comes after, if I'm correct, after a weekend of celebration down there. I know you were part of all that. It just comes. There's no good time to have this type of bad news, is there?
Well, no, and it's funny because this was down in Daytona, the Steve Spurrier reunion, and I was luckily enough to be invited. Players began to hear about this, and their friends were texting him. They were reading stuff on Twitter, I guess, and they were coming up to me and asking me about it. And I found out what I could for them, but again, it was still a little bit sketchy yesterday. In fact, some names were thrown out there that weren't even involved in it. But I think more than anything, Paul, I think everybody understands Florida had a lot of momentum going. Both on the recruiting trail where they've had an amazing off-season recruiting, and then the fact that they've 13-3 the last 2 years in the SEC, and they feel like they've got their best team coming back. And this certainly, like I said on my show, Paul, I think it's a flat tire. It's not like you can't fix it, but it definitely is a flat tire right now, considering all the momentum they had.
So let's get into what you know and what we all think we know about this. What's this all about, Pat?
Well, basically, it's about using money to get things you weren't supposed to get, and then selling them, and then claiming that the cars were stolen, from what everybody is reporting, and it's fraud. Basically, is what happened there, and unfortunately for Florida, it happened with Antonio Callaway, who's had his issues in the past. So I think a lot of people are looking at what Coach Mack ends up doing with him. I mean, everybody. I personally wouldn't kick him off the team. I think when you go back to the first incident where he was exonerated, you question how that happened, but he was exonerated. And then the second issue is a plea bargain, but I would have him on a very tight leash the rest of the way. I'm not sure he should play in the second game, and maybe not even the third game as well.
Do we know? Is this a? Was Matt clear about the one game, 7 players, one game, or is Callaway a different story?
Well, I don't know if Callaway for sure is. I would think he would be the one guy who is. I don't know about amounts and everything like that. So until that gets reported, we won't know about that. But all we know for sure is these guys are suspended for Michigan, and that's all we know. We don't know about the game 2. We don't know about game 3. And I think what Coach McElwain had to say was interesting, in that's the game these guys had been looking forward to ever since they walked off the field at the Outback Bowl, because it is a different place. As you know, Paul, you've been there. Jerry World is incredible. It's not my favorite stadium, but it's the biggest I've ever been in. But it's not to get to play where the Cowboys play, not to get to play in a national televised game, not to get to play against Northern Colorado probably isn't going to hurt them that much. But this game is the one that really punishes them. But I don't know that we know either way whether there'll be more more games missed, but to say that it's only a one-game suspension would probably be speculating too much at this point.
Let's get to what fans are most interested in. What effect does it have on the Gators' chances of winning this game? Give it to us. We know about Callaway. A lot of these players are relatively unknown to the fans outside of Gainesville.
Yeah, and I think more than anything, especially the freshmen, they aren't going to be able to practice for a few weeks, and that's going to, stunt their growth, and that's a factor as well. But the one guy, Kavanis Davis, had played last year. I think he had 5 quarterback hurries during the season, so he did play a little bit, and it was. But the one thing that's for Florida is that the two positions where the two guys probably who played the most, in Callaway and Davis, are the two positions where they're the deepest. They have plenty of wide receivers. Do they have a guy like Callaway? No, not so far. We haven't seen one like him. But they definitely have enough depth there. The where they may get hurt, and we just don't know right now, is at linebacker, where they have 2 of the freshman linebackers were among this. I don't want to call it a sting operation, but it was certainly an issue there where they got suspended. And I don't know that they would have played anyway, but certainly if you get a couple of rolled ankles, you could be in a rough situation there at linebacker. But look, my feeling is Florida's still got a roster good enough to beat Michigan. I know Michigan was favored by 2.5. It's gone up to 4 and 4.5 in Vegas, which tells you the way they're looking at it. I still feel like it's a toss-up game. Either way, I don't think Callaway being out for this game changes it that drastically. It does change it, however. Michigan, as you know, Paul, is still a team that's replacing an awful lot of talent from last year. And if Antonio had turned his ankle in practice and was out, I don't know that we would feel like, well, that game's over. I think there's some people who feel like, well, this, now Michigan's going to steamroll. I don't think that's the case at all.
You may not know the exact number, but I keep hearing that. What is the scholarship number for Florida? It seems like it's pretty low. Is that correct?
No, I think they replenished it for the most part. I think they were around 83. I want to say. Maybe 81. They may be down a little bit, maybe holding back.
But not significantly.
I know they're
really
not significant. No. Now they may be. Now you take 7 guys away, and then you take the guys you're planning on redshirting away, and then you take the injured guys away, and the number of bodies available to go to Dallas, it may not be very hard to get on that trip.
Yeah, no, there's probably some professors who will be making the trip on the.
They may take me.
I don't know. I think you're still pretty low on the list, Pat.
It's that bad knee.
Yeah, no. Let me, in terms of McElwain, I've read. It's always love to read stuff about coaches, praising him while other coaches have not made these type of decisions. Is this McElwain's decision, Pat, or is this an institutional decision?
Well, I think it's Mac and it's Scott Strickland working in conjunction because it usually has been since Scott got here, and it was always with Jeremy. There were times when Jeremy said, here's what we have to do. If we don't do this, we're going to have issues with the NCAA. We're going to have issues with other entities, whether it's police or whatever. Here's what we have to do, and I've not always agreed with everything that he's come out with. I always thought Carlos Dunlap should have gotten more into game suspension for the cops stopped him when he was asleep at the wheel, but he was unlike Deshaun Hand, he was driving. So but the AD is certainly very involved in this decision, and again, we'll see what happens going forward. Whether it ends up being more than one game for Callaway, especially. I wouldn't imagine for the other guys, but again, they probably are still in the stages. Now, this happened a while back. This wasn't like it happened over the weekend. It's just when it came out was over the weekend. So, but they're probably still looking into issues that they may have. I mean, Paul, you know better than I do the whole Alabama book selling thing that happened. What was that? 2007?
Yeah, and it turned out to be very serious. They kept a bunch of players out of the Tennessee game and then other games later, and they ended up having to give back a lot of wins, if I remember.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't think that would be an issue here because if this all happened after last season, especially you're talking about a bunch of freshmen. So you definitely are going to sit the freshmen out as long as it takes because you don't want to have to get back wins. Or
so you're saying this may not be over with.
I don't think it's 100% over with. I think the big bomb is dropped, but there could still be some collateral damage.
What's going on with the quarterback race?
Well, everything that we're hearing, again, all we can do is watch them throw a little bit. And, our guys are out there watching them throw, but that's about all you can do. You can't watch them actually practice. So, but they go back and forth on who's going with the ones, who's going with the twos. Coach McElwain said today that Del Rio did some nice things in their scrimmage Friday, that all the guys did good with the ones. My gut on this, and I may be wrong, is that he's not going to tell anybody who's going to start until they trot out in the field September 2nd. And I wouldn't either, because they're all three kind of different quarterbacks. So why not at least make Michigan get ready for all three of them and the offenses that all three of them could bring?
Do you think we could see all three in that game?
I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I think they'd love to get a guy and go with him, and this is our guy, and if something happens, we have options. I think that's what his philosophy would be. But I wouldn't be surprised to see a bunch of, for example, Kadarius Toney, who's certainly got the ability to run the ball and is a very speedy guy and can throw it because, was a quarterback, played quarterback in the spring game, putting him in some Wildcats. So, I don't know, we may see one of those games where you see 3 or 4 quarterbacks, because I know Michigan's still got a quarterback battle going too.
And Pat, a couple more things. You said you don't think this is going to have that much of an impact on the Michigan game. Some would say impactful player, offense isn't that spectacular. I really would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, I'm not saying it won't have any impact, but I think it's one position where Florida could afford somebody being out. For example, they lost Marcel Harris, who's nowhere near the player that Antonio Callaway is. I think that's a more impactful injury situation because they're not that great. They're going to have to play some young kids, some redshirt freshmen and freshmen in that spot versus you've got Tyree Cleveland, you've got Brandon Powell, who's played a bunch. You've got obviously Dre Massey back. They say today he's 100% now. Hammond and Swain, who both have lit it up in camp. So they've got plenty of receivers. Now, do they have a Callaway? No. He's the best receiver they have by far, and probably the most biggest impact player. So it'll have an impact. I just think it's a spot where it's not killer.
Let's end on a good note. You mentioned the Spurrier reunion on the beach. So other than this news starting to trickle out, what else was the big buzz item with the head ball coach?
Well, it was a great turnout. First one they've had, and they're going to try to do it every year. And it was great to see so many of the guys and Jesse Palmer. We were telling stories. There was a lot of stories, believe it or not. But I think all his quarterbacks showed up except Rex and Terry Dean. I think the rest of them are all there. And a bunch of guys I was surprised to see. In fact, Darren Hambrick was there, which blew me away because Darren was booted off the team back in '94 at the Sugar Bowl incident. But he was there, talked to him a little bit, and ball coach got up there and got those guys through their little speeches, and it was pretty entertaining stuff. But it was just good to see. And again, I don't know how many head coaches out there could get a crowd like that of his former players to show up. But there's definitely a respect and love for Steve, even though he may have told you. In fact, somebody pointed out that he did say it's not your fault, it's my fault for putting you in the game, and he said I only said that once. But I'm not sure any of us were buying that because everybody said it at the same time.
Pat Dooley joining us on the Callaway situation. Something tells me it won't be the last time we talk about this in the next 2.5 weeks. Pat, we'll talk soon. Thank you very, very much.
Always, Paul. Thank you very much.
Oh, you bet. One of the best, Pat Dooley.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
You're not worth a thrill.
Okay, Kevin, for the grand prize of $1 million, what color is the White House?
I know this.
5 seconds.
Oh, switching to Geico could save you a bunch of money on car insurance?
Okay. Judges? That's true, Kevin. They'll allow it. Congratulations. You're a winner.
Woo!
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Booger McFarland joining us. Always good to catch up with Booger, good afternoon. What's been going on?
What's the deal, Paul?
Man, we were just hanging out. John Hayes trying to make a big deal about Lindsey Scott leaving LSU. Should I buy?
No, Paul. You know what? I don't think it's a big deal. When I heard the news that came out earlier today, I went back and looked. And normally when a school has a lot of kids leaving the program, they're going to be low on the scholarship limit. So I went back and took a look. Each school can have 85 scholarships. Right now, LSU's got 84 guys on scholarship. So they've had some guys leave out of the program for different reasons, no one overwhelming reason. But I think Lindsey Scott's a quarterback that realized that, LSU's trying to upgrade the position. Danny Elling is going to be the guy this year. And Matt Canada has said he's going to find some good quarterbacks. They got Miles Brennan now, and I think Scott realized that his time probably is not going to come in Baton Rouge, much like Blake Barnett and some of the other guys around the conference, Kyle Allen at Texas A&M. They realize that, guess what, they're just not going to play. And so they're deciding to move on rather than sit on the bench and hope.
Meanwhile, the Gators have lost 7 players at least for the opener. They may be gone longer. We don't know, including Antonio Callaway, who has gotten in and out of trouble countless times. Booger, where are you on this? What does it mean?
Well, first of all, I want to applaud Coach McElwain. And a lot of people around the conference are trying to draw 2 parallels between what Coach McElwain did in this situation and what Coach Saban did or didn't do in his situation with Hand. Here's what I'll say. I think Coach McElwain is doing the right thing, especially with Callaway. Anytime you have a guy who is a repeat offender, and he's shown that, guess what, I just don't get this thing that's called right from wrong. I think Coach Mack is doing something that a lot of coaches around the country, and not only in this conference but around the country, should take heed to and do. And so I applaud him. Is it going to hurt Florida in the game? Yeah. But should Florida still be able to beat Michigan, a team that's losing 18 starters? They only have 1 or 2 starters back on defense. They have a quarterback battle that's still up in the air, even though I think Wilton Speight is going to be the quarterback. Florida still should be able to win that game with their speed, especially if Zaire is the quarterback. So I think, all in all, this is a great lesson being taught by Jim McElwain. I applaud him. And I just hope these kids learn that, guess what, man? Just stop doing knucklehead stuff and do the right thing, and you won't get suspended.
Booger McFarland with us. Jarrett Stidham today named the starter at Auburn. This is about as big a surprise to me as it is to most people who just found out you were bald. This is not – I don't know.
Paul,
I just felt like saying something like
quarterback.
It's not often I get to make fun of somebody's hair, okay?
Well, listen, the only time I make fun of your hair, Paul, is when you haven't gotten a haircut in about, 6 weeks and your sides look like kind of hedges. That's the only time I make fun of your hair. Other than that, you and I are kind of in the same boat. As far as Jarrett Stidham, we knew he was going to be the quarterback the moment he signed.
Sure
the moment he signed in Auburn and Gus Malzahn said he was on the roster, he was going to be the starting quarterback. And I think the more important thing that's going to happen down there is whether or not Gus is going to get out of the way. Like, we've had this discussion, and we've talked all along about the offensive system and what's happening down in Auburn. Gus Malzahn has to become a CEO and take his hands off the offense. If he does that, the offense will be fine, and Jarrett Stidham stays healthy. I think Auburn is in for a huge year. Paul, I've said it all offseason, the biggest challenger to Alabama in this conference is the Auburn Tigers, and I think Gus has to take his hands off the offense for that to happen.
On that subject, we're a couple weeks into training, 2 weeks and a half before the big game in Atlanta. Are you, or how concerned are you about Alabama? What do you hear about the Crimson Tide's camp so far?
Well, I think the things you hear are what you hear from everybody. Like, I've never turned a TV on or picked up a newspaper and heard, man, Georgia's having a terrible camp. LSU's awful. Alabama can't get it right. Like, everybody's saying good things right now. But I think if you're going to be a realist, here's the things that you have to concern yourself with when it comes to Alabama. What's the offense going to look like? Brian Daboll, how are they going to make sure Jalen Hurts has confidence? Because at the end of the season last year, especially against Clemson, Paul, he had no confidence. That's a concern. Concern number 2, what's the defense going to look like in the second half? There are no doubts to me this defense is going to be fine. They're going to have talent. But the problem against Clemson, the defense wore down. And even though they had more depth last year, they still wore down. So what's the defense going to look like in the second half of games, particularly the first game when you're probably your most winded and most tired because you haven't played a game all year? That's number two. And then I think thirdly, Paul, there's a lot of turnover on the coaching staff. So this will be the first time this coaching staff works together in probably the biggest opener in Nick Saban's career. So how's that going to work? So if you're a Crimson Tide fan or alumni, I think those are the things you concern yourself with. Vegas has Bama favorite. Paul, I'll say this. I think it's a pick'em game. Florida State's offensive line is supposed to be better. Jimbo Fisher has more confidence than I've seen him have in a long time. I think it's a pick'em game, and I can't wait to watch.
Booger McFarland, a lot of things to talk about. We heard a clip a few minutes ago from Butch Jones. I don't know if you've heard this or not, but he was not happy, and I think he's talking about you in particular. Actually, he's not. Everyone knows Champions of Life, 5-star heart, brick by brick, and he said the criticism of his program has been grossly overblown. I'm not blaming you because a lot of people have talked about it, but you're a pretty prominent guy, as ABC, ESPN. I mean, you're now like a major domo of college football. Your thoughts on Butch now pushing back on the criticism?
Well, I think there's some truth to what Butch is saying. Here's where Butch loses credibility with me. In the last couple of seasons, Butch Jones has gotten to the podium, and he's basically used the cliches and used all the analogies to try to win the press conference. He made a statement that every team has cliches and every team has kind of slogans. He's right. A lot of teams have those. Like LSU's always one heartbeat, one team since Ed Orgeron took over. Like every team has things like that they rally on. The thing about it, Paul, is those teams don't bring those to the press conference. Butch brings his to the press conference. He leads a 15-minute press conference talking about Champions of Life and brick by brick and the 25 points. Like when you get to a press conference, all we want to hear is what happened and why. And for the first time, Paul, in his tenure at Tennessee this year at SEC Media Days, Butch Jones, after I said that, the balls are going to be abysmal this year, Butch Jones got up there and basically sounded like a normal football coach. Like that's the first time he's done that. And I think the criticism is fair. He does have a point, but the criticism is fair because most coaches keep the slogans inside their team room. Butch brings them to the podium and just feeds them to the media. That's why the media gets tired of all the slogans.
And finally, on that subject, I've heard Tennessee predictions all over the board. Some optimism. Maybe the Florida situation will help them. What do you think, Booger? Where is Tennessee going to end up?
Well, here's what I'll say, Paul. They had 18 starters back last year. They had a veteran quarterback. They had two very good running backs. They had two defensive linemen that are going to play in the NFL, and they couldn't get it done last year. And when I mean by couldn't get it done is they couldn't win the SEC East and they couldn't go to Atlanta. So, Paul, if I was a betting man, what gives you hope when you're going to break in 18 new starters this year? Okay, you're not going to have the dominant defensive ends you had last year. Am I supposed to go against all logical thinking that this is Tennessee's year? No. I said it before and I'll say it again. Regardless of who's playing quarterback, whether it's Normandy or Garantano, I think they'll be able to move the ball a little bit. I think the defense is not going to be very good, and I think in the end, right now, if I were to kind of size up the SEC East, I'm going Georgia, probably go Florida, number 2. I like Kentucky right there at number 3. I know a lot of people are going to say I'm crazy. I just like their style. They know what they're doing. They got a lot of guys back. Snell is a very good running back. I don't think Tennessee's going to be very good this year, Paul. I just think last year was their year having a veteran team. I think this year they're going to struggle a little bit. And I think at the end of the season, the powers that be in Knoxville are going to have to figure out, okay, are we okay with just being good enough, or do we want to take a chance at great? And by that I mean, do we keep Butch around and say, okay, you know what, we're really, really good right now, and Butch has made a lot of strides, and we're no longer a bottom feeder. Are we okay with that, or do we take a chance at really, really being great? It's almost like, Paul, you remember the Golden State Warriors? They had Mark Jackson as the head coach, and Mark Jackson won 50 games a couple of times, and they fired him. And everybody was like, well, why? And you bring in Steve Kerr next year and you win a championship. Sometimes, Paul, certain coaches can only get you to the hump. sometimes they can't get you over the hump. And I think the powers that be in Tennessee may have to make that decision after the season about Butch Jones.
And not very good. I think that was one of the descriptions you had. What does not very good mean to you?
I mean, if you look at the SEC record, I mean, last year, what were they, 4-4 in conference? I mean, I think you're looking something like that this year in the conference, 4-4, 3-5. I mean, overall, I think they'll get to a bowl game. But I mean, if Tennessee finishes the season 8-4, is that okay? I mean, is that going to be satisfied finishing, third in the West, or maybe third in the East or fourth in the East? I don't think that's going to be.
But right now, you would have them ranked. You would have them ranked fourth in the East. Did I hear you correctly?
Right. Yeah. Right now, Paul, like my Eastern Division standings would go Georgia 1, Florida 2, Kentucky 3, Tennessee 4. On the Western side, I would go Alabama 1, Auburn 2, LSU 3, and I don't think it really matters after that. To be honest with you, in the West. I'm just being honest with you, Paul. You know how we do it, man.
No, that's why I call you. I mean, you're my go-to guy. I'll be quoting you for the rest of my life.
Hey, listen, Paul. I love it. I love turning the TV on, especially like there are two times I love watching you on TV. One, when you've gotten a fresh haircut because I can barely tell you have hair, and two, when you haven't had one in about 2 months because you look like you got the little hedges on the side of your head. Man, it looks awesome, buddy.
Well, my favorite time of the year is spring because I grow flowers out of my left side of the head. Well, Booger, all I can say is thank you. This has been so much fun.
Hey, anytime, Paul, man.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Put a little cherry on the top.
Chris Lowe, busy guy. He's been all over the country, and we won't keep him long because I'm sure he's got a plane to catch. Chris Lowe, good afternoon. I'm just curious, have you gone over the frequent flyer limit in the last 5 or 6 days? Where have you been?
Well, Paul, I just want you to know I'm using your first-class privileges. That's okay, right?
Well, sure.
I'm actually in cloudy Happy Valley, a very pleasant Happy Valley, Penn State today. But, yeah, I've been out in L.A., at USC last week, Florida State, Alabama, and I'll be at Ohio State on Wednesday. So if I forget what time zone or zip code, then I'll call you and you can remind me.
Well, as you go around these places, certainly every place is different, whether it's Florida State or Alabama or the West Coast or now getting close to the East Coast. But let me stay with Florida State and Alabama for just a moment. Just juxtapose those two experiences. Man, you almost lost me driving with Jimbo the other day. Somebody needs to stop him and send him back to driver's ed. But because of the interest in that game, let's start there.
Both those teams, I got a chance to watch them both practice as well. They look a lot like each other. The way they practice, the way they're constructed, Paul, I mean, the defensive linemen are all big and long and explosive. The running back stable, I mean, there's 3, 4, 5 guys at both places who can play anywhere. And it's really no coincidence because I was talking to Jimbo about it. He says, listen, we bump heads with Alabama now in the recruiting trail, probably as much and more so than anybody else in college football. And I've said this repeatedly, Paul, and I believe it. I think there's 4 genuine recruiting machines now in college football. Alabama, Florida State, Ohio State, and I think you got to throw Clemson in there. Those 4 really don't recruit, they pick. So I think this matchup between Florida State and Alabama, these kids all were recruited just about at least 80% of them by both schools, and 2 programs that mirror each other very closely.
You know Nick Saban extremely well, and he has said things to you in the past that he hasn't said elsewhere. Not to reveal state secrets here, but what's your impression from being around him?
Well, I think he likes the team. He likes where they are. Every coach pour mouths a little bit. Okay, they're not all Lou Holtz, but they all pour mouth a little bit. But the conversations I had with Nick this spring and this preseason, he's genuinely concerned about some of the defensive talent they've lost each of the last 2 years. They lost a lot of guys early, as you know, a lot of guys that were impact players on that side of the ball. And yes, they recruited well. They still look physically as good as anybody in the country. But there's a lot of experience, a lot of guys who are alpha dogs on that defense, Paul, that are gone. new guys are going to have to step forward. They need guys, like a Raekwon Davis, who's had a really good preseason at this point, hasn't done a whole lot, but they need those guys like that. I just throw him out as an example to really take a big step forward this year. And I think one of the reasons you've seen them try to go back to what they do or what they have done typically on offense under Nick, and the reason he brought Brian Dable there in the first place, is they may have to lean on their offense a little bit more this year. Now they're always going to be good on defense, and they're always going to make a lot of big plays and try to force the issue. But they want to be more varied on offense. That's the big thing. And watching them practice and talk with Nick, is as good as they were at times under Lane, he just felt like they did not use all of their skill players as well as they could. Spread the football around and be balanced. You can still run the football, but get it down the field. I mean, when they've been at their best, and Nick will be the first one to tell you this, they've always been able to bloody your nose running the football and throw the football down the field vertically. And I think that's what Nick wants to get back to.
And you mentioned Dable. What's your takeaway from him, and especially after chatting with Jalen Hurts?
Well, Jalen looks a lot more decisive, and Jalen feels that way too, which is probably more important. Knowing what to do with the football, having a better feel, he told me, Paul, when he walks up to the line of scrimmage. He's watched a lot of tape with Dable. They've gone over a lot of things. But seeing what defenses are doing, having a better answer for things when he gets to the line of scrimmage, I think that's number one. And just being more instinctive and more decisive of where to go with football. Listen, he's got a very strong arm. They're not going to put him in a situation where he's not able to run the football. I know a lot of Alabama fans have asked me, so this talk about going back to pro style, we got to still use Jalen Hurts. Hey, they're still going to use his feet, and he's going to be better, I think, in that regard. But he's not going to pull the ball down and run as much or as quickly if that first read's not there. Nick told me, quite frankly, when I was there last week, that he feels like the entire passing game has been better coached, has been better developed. It also helps to that end that Jalen's a year older. It's not just a shot at Lane Kiffin, but I think he feels like across the board they're more equipped and more balanced in their ability to throw the football.
Well, I don't know. It sounded like a shot at Lane Kiffin, but
no, imagine those two taking shots at each other. That never happens, right?
I am curious, though, as you walk through the halls of UA these days, what is the view of Lane Kiffin, assuming there is one?
Well, I think most, listen, those guys are all pros, and they understand that Lane was really good in a lot of things he did. We know he can call plays. Was the chemistry great on that staff there at the end? Listen, I'd be lying if I said it was. I think anybody that worked there, from Nick Saban all the way down, would tell you the chemistry wasn't great. Part of it was Lane was ready to be a head football coach somewhere else. And you know what? Like some relationships out there, whether it's husband, wife, co-workers, the relationship between Nick Saban and Lane Kiffin had sort of run its course. Both of them realized that. They knew that. It was unfortunate the way it ended. But I think most of those people on that staff, the Alabama staff, would tell you that they feel like now that it's probably back to the way it was under Saban with the chemistry, the continuity. It just wasn't – there was just something missing there toward the end of last season. And part of it, again, was Lane's trying to do two jobs, get his staff ready at Florida Atlantic, watch recruiting tape for Florida Atlantic, and it just didn't mesh.
There was some bad chemistry. I think they lost 3 times with Lane Kiffin in 3 years.
Well, exactly, and let's be fair to Lane too. I think the last 3 times. Well, what's the stat though that he's lost? Nick Saban's lost the last 3 times that Lane has not been on his staff.
No doubt.
So I'll be the first one, and I know Lane very well too, to stand up and say, listen, the guy did a lot more than he'll be given credit for. You know how revisionist history is sometimes. People will look back and say, well, Lane Kiffin did this. Listen, they won the SEC championship with Blake Sims playing quarterback, and you go back and look at the job he did with him, the job that Lane did with Jake Coker when they won the national championship. So there was a lot of good on his watch. I just think at the end of the day, as I said earlier, the best way to explain it, that relationship ran its course. And to be honest, Paul, it really went probably further than anybody thought it would.
Chris, I didn't think it would get past the first year. And it almost didn't, as you well know. That was obviously a showstopper there with that line. Chris, I think we've lost you, but anyway, thanks for the time.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. You were just choosing not to respond, I guess.
No, they both were good for each other in their own way.
Yeah.
I don't know that Lane would have ever had a shot to go anywhere else and be a head coach had he not come to Alabama and worked under Saban. And again, with some of the issues that they had at quarterback, some of their limitations, what Lane was able to get out of the quarterback play there, while he was there was, I think, speaks for itself. So they were, while it lasted, they were good for each other. A little bit of oil and water. And Lane, when I was with Lane for several days this past spring down in Boca Raton, and he admitted, he says, listen, I got a little too loose with my mouth, more than I needed to. That didn't set well with Coach Saban. I don't think it set well with anybody in Coach Saban's family, and that probably caught up with it. Lane's not one of these guys who thinks first and talks second.
Well, we got to cut Lane some slack, Chris. That had never happened before, so we'll give him a one-time pass on being loose with his mouth.
Listen, having done it as long as I have, I find it refreshing when coaches say what's on their mind. Spurrier always did it. Lane is sort of the same way. Now, Lane probably pokes the bear as much as most guys, at least the bear when the bear happens to be his boss, more than most guys. But I've always enjoyed being around Lane, and it makes our jobs a lot more fun.
Yeah, I would say talking about your time at Alabama in dog years might upset the bear or the alpha dog for that matter. Listen, Chris, be safe. Call me when you get back home. I'm just more than anything curious to see the frequent flyer miles. That's all.
Well, they're piling up, and as I said, Paul, I'm gonna use your first class privileges. So I know you
will love. You will love the pretzels that they give you on the airlines.
I look forward to them. It's always a pleasure, Paul.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate your time. I know it's a busy time flying around the country every day. He's up in Happy Valley. Didn't get a chance to ask about Coach Franklin, but we'll do that soon.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast. You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
You're not worth a flip.
So many different things happening all at once. We want to welcome in Coach Pat Dye, another Hall of Fame and legendary coach. We want to get his thoughts on Coach Stallings, but we'll start with Coach Broyles, who passed away earlier today at the age of 92. Coach Dye, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Paul, thank you. My first thought of Coach Broyles goes back to the 40s and 50s, because he played at Boys High in Decatur, Georgia, and went to Georgia Tech and played quarterback, and he was an assistant coach at Georgia Tech when I was being recruited by Georgia Tech in 1956. And, of course, he was destined at that time. He's offensive coordinator at Georgia Tech, and obviously he's going to be a head football coach. And of course, following his career throughout, there's never been a more class guy than Coach Broyles. I mean, and had a unbelievable insight and knowledge of the game, and and a close friend. And he kind of really took me under his wing when I became a head coach. From a standpoint of, he called from time to time, and we talk about things and just football and life in general, and just a great human being. He called me in I don't know what year it was. He and Keith Jackson had done our 81 and 82 game against Alabama and the 83 game. And it might have been in 83, after 83 or something. He called me and he said, Coach, he said, I'm getting out, and it could have been before that, I guess. Whenever it was, he was making a change in his coaching staff he's hiring a new head coach at Arkansas. And he said, I got 4 former players that I think I can hire any one of the 4, and I want your opinion. And he said Barry Switzer and Jimmy Johnson and Fred Akers and Kenny Hatfield. I said, Coach, I said, you call that 4 names, and every one of them is different. I said, you got to hire what you want. I said, man, you can have anything you want with that foursome. And, of course, he hired Kenny Hatfield, and we played against Kenny in that 84 Liberty Bowl. But Coach Broyles we'll miss him. And football will miss him. And I know Arkansas and what he meant to that state and school and institution and the tradition that he created there. And the SEC's going to miss him. I mean, he's one of the class guys and always stand up for the right thing, and just not only the head coaches that came out of his program, the great assistant coaches that went through Arkansas. Richard Williamson, a close friend of mine, left Alabama twice and went to Arkansas to coach for Coach Broyles, and but I mean
and Coach, much like you, he was not afraid to give his opinion either. No. And, I mean, and as a matter of fact, you could call him opinionated. But that's all right. There's a lot of us like that. And, you know, he was, when he believed in something, he believed in it. And, but it's a sad day for the conference. And, of course, Coach Stallings and I were supposed to speak in Huntsville tonight together. One of those where you got a moderator and we're just going up there and have fun. And I guess he had another mild stroke at the airport in Dallas. And I got a report just a few minutes ago and said that he is in the hospital and resting comfortably, but he was going to be in the hospital a few days, but it didn't appear to be, you know, serious. And I don't know. He told the folks that we were speaking for tonight. He said we want to reschedule this for later in the fall. So he's pretty optimistic about getting out and getting back, and you know, and going back to doing what he does on the farm and speaking. He's really doing too much, in my opinion, and he needs to slow down some. But you know, I see him every 4 times a year at the Great Southern Wood board meeting. He and I are the only 2 people on the board that's not in Jimmy's family, Jimmy Raines. And, you know, but Jimmy looks out for both of us. He and Coach Stallings are very close, and of course, you know, I'm close to Jimmy, and the business is doing well, I can tell you. No doubt. Well, Coach, let me and I hate to move on from both those stories because they're obviously incredibly important and serious, but I do want to get your thoughts before you go about Gus Malzahn naming Jarrett Stidham today as the starting quarterback.
Well, I'm not surprised. You know, I watched both scrimmages, and after the first scrimmage, you know, neither one of them looked that good. They both struggled, but that was to be expected, in my opinion, because it takes offense a little longer to get into the flow of the game once you put the pads on, because you got there all summer and all spring, you know, during the summer workouts, and you're throwing the ball against the air with nobody bumping you and knocking you around, and then all of a sudden you line up and somebody's on your nose out there, and you come off the line and they stop your momentum or they disrupt your route or whatever, and the quarterbacks are not throwing with the kind of pressure that they get on a scrimmage, and they didn't look very good. But Stidham, they didn't look bad, but they wasn't exactly like you expect, and nobody else on the offense was either. They got penalties and kind of a little bit on the sloppy side, but Sean White threw 2 interceptions in the scrimmage, and Stidham didn't have any. And this past Saturday was exactly the opposite. I mean, all the quarterbacks had big plays, and now we set out 3 or 4 of the top secondary folks with just minor stuff, and to get some young kids some experience back there, because we're a little thin in the secondary in places, and they all had big plays, which I think that we're going to have the potential to have big plays. I mean, all 3 of them, and when I say 3 of them, I'm talking about Malik Willis, and he's got a tremendous upside to him, and because he's a true freshman. But Sean White threw another interception and then threw another one right in the hands that they dropped. And I think that probably made the decision for the coaches. Just those 3 interceptions should have been 4 turnovers and 2 scrimmages, and the difference in the 2 quarterbacks. But I'm not surprised. You'd love Stidham. I mean, the way he carries himself, he's got a smile on his face and a good look in his eye. He's a confident kid, not cocky. Just he's just a joy to be around, and that's got to carry over to his teammates and the rest, in all of the Auburn family, for that matter. Because the coaches see it, but the big thing is his teammates see it, and like I said, I'm not surprised. I thought after the first scrimmage, it's going to be a hard choice, but the 2 interceptions and 3 turnovers and 2 scrimmages probably made a difference.
Coach, you know the optimism and the media and everyone is talking up Auburn, but if there was something that you would be concerned about with this football team, what would it be?
Well, the chemistry. Paul, every great football team has great chemistry, and you can't tell about the chemistry until you see them play and you see them overcome. Come back late in the ball game and win close games, and chemistry's got to be earned during the course of the season, and if you got it, you'll see it and you'll know it. And if you don't have it, you'll see it and you'll know it. But I think this is probably the most talented football team that I've seen at Auburn, top to bottom. Now, they're a little thin in the secondary, like I mentioned, and they're a little inexperienced at the wide receivers. We got to settle on who's going to be who up front on the offensive line, and they have a tremendous upside. Just depends on how bad they want to, how good they want to be. And because I think that if they really want to be a great offensive line, they can be one. It's just a matter of if they're going to mature into that. But and they've got depth in the offensive line. Defensively, we got most of the guys that played last year, except for Adams and Lawson, and they were great players. But I think defensively, we got a chance to be better. All the linebackers are back, and we got some young folks up front on defense that are going to make an impact, or should, if they just follow the normal pattern. We got talent. And the biggest problem that we got, really, is a punter. And they might have settled on the punter Saturday in the scrimmage, but we don't have a proven punter right now. And but we got probably as good a kicker as is in the country.
You got a great place kicker.
Oh yeah, and I don't want him to punt. Now that's me personally, because sometimes you trying to do both, it takes away from what you're great at, and I don't want that to happen. And I don't think Coach Malzahn does either. So it's a football team that has a tremendous amount of potential. And I'm anxious to see us play. I'm excited about them. There's not anything that you can see being in and around the football team and players. They like each other. The players like the coaches like the players, and everything is almost too good for it to fail. But we had a similar situation 2 years ago, and it just went up in smoke. But I don't think I really, really like the freshman. You put that name in the back of your head now, because he's going to be a great football player in the Southeastern Conference. Malik Willis, and he looks exactly like Nick Marshall, except he's faster and can throw it a lot better. May not be quite as quick. And has got no fear, because they practice him without their red jersey on. and he's got, but he's a freshman, so that I don't think he'll beat out Stidham, but they may have a role for him, in some capacity, because he is a dangerous running the football.
Coach, many thanks.
Thank you. It's always great, and you got a great show, Paul.
Appreciate it. Well, tremendous comments. I really appreciate what you had to say about Coach Stallings.
Thank you for listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast. The Paul Finebaum Show airs weekdays on the SEC Network, beginning at 3 Eastern.